Okay, good evening all. Hello and welcome to the Arboriculture Association's headquarters here in Gloucestershire in the UK for another Wednesday webinar. My name's John Parker, Chief Executive Officer of the Association and your host for this evening. As ever, please feel free to say hello in the chat. Some of you are already doing that. Let us know where you're watching from, but please make sure you select everyone as you do so we can all see who you are and where you are. If you've got any questions, then please submit them through the Q&A button, and then we'll work through as many as we can at the end. A little reminder for you that next week, our webinar will feature two colleagues from the Netherlands, Henry Kuppen and Wendy Battenberg from Terra Nostra. Henry and Wendy will be presenting some of their work with biochar and trees, which we're very much looking forward to. And you can register for that one free right now through the normal channels. And I hope that we'll see plenty of you there. But right now, this evening, I'm very, very pleased and excited to be able to welcome Mark Johnston, author of The Tree Experts. My copy is right here, A History of Professional Arboriculture in Britain, which is also the subject of his presentation tonight. I've been trying to coax Mark into participating in a webinar for some time now, so I'm absolutely delighted that he's joining us this evening. Just as a small sales pitch, and it won't be the first one tonight, but if you haven't already bought the book, what have you been doing? I hope you're inspired to do so this evening. And as I'm sure you'd imagine, you can get hold of that through the Arboriculture Association's website. And there'll be more details of that in the chat soon, I'm sure. So that's more than enough of hearing from me. I'm now very pleased to welcome Mark. Mark, over to you, sir.
Thank you very much, John. I'll just go to screen share. Well, can I begin by thanking John and the Arboricultural Association for inviting me to give this talk this evening. And I'm just absolutely blown away by the number of people who have turned up tonight. It's extraordinary, a really good turnout. And I want to say a big hello to everyone, but especially a big hello to those people who are my former colleagues and former students. And I'm sure there are many of you out there. So yes, we're giving a little talk here on the Tree Experts, A History of Professional Arboriculture. Just trying to, that's right. I'd like to begin by just saying that my interest in the history of arboriculture began when I worked on the tree gang at Kew Gardens back in 1982. And I'd recently resigned as a senior tree officer for a London borough. And I was looking for a teaching job, but I wanted to, while I was looking for a suitable teaching job, I wanted to spend some time working on the amazing tree collection at Kew. So it was not only in a historic landscape, but I worked on some of its historic trees, a really wonderful experience. And I've always been a big fan of Kew since actually working there. But outside Kew, there was something that was equally inspiring for me. It was the Lloyd's of Kew bookshop, run by Dan Lloyd. And it was Dan Lloyd who introduced me to some of the famous writers on subjects about trees and landscape. And this was actually the beginning of my own remarkable library of old and rare books on trees, landscape, and arboriculture. So double inspiration there from Kew. When I was approaching official retirement from Myerscough College, I wondered how I could use my time to develop arboriculture in the future in my so-called official retirement. And I've been fortunate to have worked at the cutting edge of a lot of major projects. And my interest in the historical aspects had to have gone on the back burner. But I thought that come retirement, I would really focus more on the historical aspects that had interested me greatly. So my first book, Trees in Towns and Cities, published in 2015, a sort of vastly expanded version of my own lecture notes on this. And this went down extremely well. And I followed that up with Street Trees in Britain, a whole history of how street trees had developed a subject, again, that had not been written before, and a major amount of original research actually went into that. That was published in 2017. But the book that's the focus of the talk tonight is the book that I've always really wanted to write. This is the story of my own industry and profession. And it's been a major labor of love, really. And I'm absolutely delighted, how it's turned out. Published June last year, and we're getting some really cracking reviews of the book. And tonight, I just want to give you a little taster of what's in the book. It's based on a huge amount of original research. It covers a 4-year period from the actual start of the project to the publication. So, a major project in that respect. It covers a period of 2,000 years from the Romans to the present. It draws on primary sources from each era as much as possible. One of the things that I've learned in my historical research is to be quite wary of secondary sources, what people write today about what happened in the past, because they're not always accurate. So I tend to go to the primary sources as much as possible. A lot of people were involved in contributing to my research and in the production of the book, some 70 individuals, and they're listed in the acknowledgements. Of those individuals, some 23 took part in telephone interviews, ranging from 30 minutes to over 2 hours. And that focused mainly on the 20th century, and in particular, the second half of the 20th century. That's a period of history which a lot of people have different views on, and I wanted to get a range of views to present something that I felt was authentic. The book has got some 560 pages. There are around 1,000 individual references, and this is particularly good for anybody else coming behind me for primary sources, an absolute wealth of references there. And nearly 100 color and black and white images, many of which are quite rare and unique. Just say something about past landscape research and trees. Sorry, let's go back there. Just trying to remove what I have a bar at the top of my screen, but I can't seem to remove that. Many previous studies on landscape history make significant reference to trees. That's true. However, much of this concerns how trees featured in the design of various landscapes. There is often little reference to how those trees were actually planted, established, maintained, and managed. And that's partly because many of the people who have actually undertaken those studies do not come from a background of experience in practical arboriculture. I can safely say that I've been involved in arboriculture now for about 50 years, and that's my particular experience in this. But in the last 10 years, I focus very much on the historical aspects. So I think I combine, the relevant experience for a project of this type. This next slide I put in because it focuses on the relationship between the professional gardener and the garden owner. This is actually John Rose, who was the royal gardener at the time of Charles II, and he's presenting a pineapple here to Charles II. Some people would argue that that wasn't probably grown in this country, but imported. But what it's there to highlight is the fact that many of our studies on garden history have focused on the royalty, aristocracy, and gentry, the garden owners. And it's only in the last 20 years that we've really had a lot of good studies that have been done on the professional gardeners themselves, the people who have actually done the work. And this is, the point of my book here. I'm focusing on those people throughout history who are the professional tree experts, the people who actually did the work. So just to look at the basic structure of the chapters gives you some kind of idea of the scope of the book. Each chapter begins with an outline of the major economic and social and political developments in each historic period. Something, we should be aware of is that in times of relative, social stability and economic boom, garden making, comes to the fore, and money can be spent on tree planting and tree care. They're governed by social, economic, and political factors. I also outline the main sources of research material for that particular chapter. Then we look at the tree-related features of garden and landscape design in that era. Also, the evolving scope and definitions of arboriculture. As we all probably know, what we mean by arboriculture has evolved over the years, and what was thought to be arboriculture at the beginning of the 19th century certainly isn't the way we see it today. We look at arboricultural skills and techniques commonly used in each era and what were accepted standards of practice. There's quite a lot of mention of tree propagation and tree nurseries, although that won't feature too much in the presentation tonight, but it's in the book. We look at the status of professional gardeners and tree experts. Don't forget, arboriculture for many years was thought of as a mainly craft occupation or trade, but we've now reached the point where arboriculture is also regarded as a profession with equal standing to landscape architecture, horticulture, and engineering. We cover arboriculture in the private and public sectors, particularly towards the end of the book, a lot on this. We look at education and training in arboriculture and related disciplines, right from earliest times when aspects of arboriculture were taught within horticulture and forestry, to where we have standalone arboricultural education. And lastly, on the professional organizations throughout history that have had some relevance to arboriculture. So let's begin the story. And we begin with the Romans. And I think, when we say, what did the Romans do for us? Well, they brought arboriculture to Britain. That's some achievement. In the research for this particular chapter, I had to go up a very steep learning curve. While at school, I never did Latin or never read the classics. So I was starting to read the classic Roman literature on agriculture and horticulture by people like Columella, Pliny, Virgil, and combing those early classical works for references to arboricultural work. And I came up with a huge amount of material. Don't forget that many of the early skills that were applied to large mature trees initially came from forestry in terms of pruning and felling and stump removal and such like. And the same with the Romans. This is from Trajan's column in Rome. It's a Roman triumphal column that still stands. And these are images of Roman Army Engineering Corps undertaking tree work as part of their job. Moving to Roman times in Britain, this is Lullingstone Villa. This is a Roman villa in West Sussex, and it shows the landscape in the 4th century, just before the Roman occupation ended. And there are various aspects of this landscape that rely on forestry and arboricultural skills. We can see the woodlands, the orchards, the ornamental gardens with clipped trees and topiary. So there was, quite a demand in Roman times for tree-related skills. Topiary, particularly a feature of Roman gardens, and the Romans, not only bringing arboriculture to Britain, brought topiary to Britain. And this is the Roman palace at Fishbourne in West Sussex, which shows a modern planting of the box hedge topiary. Many of the tools that we used in Roman times remained very much the same throughout history, and many of them we would recognize today, the tools that are used in horticultural and arboricultural work. And we go into some detail in the book regarding that. The Romans also had a range of job titles for their gardeners that specialized in different aspects. I won't bore you with going through the list there, which you can refer to again. But I want to draw your attention to the last on the list, which is the arborator. The Romans had a category of gardener who was the tree expert, the arborator. And this is the person that looked after trees. And throughout those Roman classics, the literature there, I found numerous references to the arborator. And possibly this is the first, reference in history to a named tree specialist. I actually found one reference to the arborator working up in a tree, pruning high up in a tree. And it was from Columella. And it's an interesting reference because he remarks that the person who was doing the tree pruning was singing while they did the work. So he must have been a very happy tree expert. Well, of course, the Romans eventually departed these islands, and we entered into what is often disparagingly called the Dark Ages. And here I was concerned in, how the knowledge that the Romans had and the gardens that the Romans developed, what was left during the Dark Ages and how was that flame kept alight. In terms of resources for my research, well, old manuscripts, obviously a very important source, no printed books in those days. But perhaps of all the chapters of my book, this is where I had to rely mostly on secondary sources. I wasn't able to go around all the sort of libraries and delve into the old ancient manuscripts. So books, for example, like John Harvey's Medieval Gardens, done in 1981, an absolute classic, was, a good starting point. And a lot of other people have written some excellent books on this period. And I was able to glean a lot of information about tree work and arboriculture. We moved to the first, earliest known original work on gardening in English. This is the Feat of Gardening by Master John Gardner. This is a manuscript. It's an original work that's in Trinity College Library in Cambridge that was written about 1440, although it's believed that it was copied from an earlier manuscript, maybe some 50 years earlier. What is particularly interesting about this, the earliest known original work on gardening in English, is that the first sections of it deal with the planting and grafting of trees. It's about trees, the early parts. So I think that's, quite significant. How was the flame of arboricultural knowledge kept alight? Well, largely in the monasteries with the monks and their own manuscripts, and in the monastic gardens, that was important, but also in the royal gardens. This is a wonderful illustration from a manuscript out of the Bodleian Library in Oxford, which shows an enclosed garden typical of the time of the medieval times. In the back there, you can see a gardener pruning or possibly cutting down a small tree using a billhook. These were really the only kind of areas where you had any sort of ornamental gardening. Another interesting source of images of early tree work, this was from the British Library. This is the Julius calendar, illustrated, and shows various sort of rural activities that would take place at certain times of the year. And here we have February, which is illustrated by tree pruning. And we have June, which is illustrated by tree felling. Lovely little images, these. Various images from the medieval period show tree-related activities, but we often question, how they were actually undertaken. And this is a typical example. This is somebody planting a tree, but if we look closely, the tree is in full leaf and it's got hardly any root on it. Is this actually an example of poor tree planting practice in medieval times, or is this just slack work on the part of the illustrator? Many historians are of the view that perhaps, the standard of arboricultural work in that time was not perhaps as great as it could be. Maybe a lot of the knowledge from the Roman period had been lost and needed to be, relearned. So we move to Tudor and early Stuart times, the green shoots, as I described it, coming through, a period of regeneration in our knowledge. This was also a period where more ornamental gardens started to be created, and the inspiration for a lot of that came, certainly in the elite gardens, British gardens, came from the Renaissance gardens of Italy and France. One individual, a Dutchman actually, was also very influential, Riedman de Vries, and this is an example of one of his designs from 1583, where you see a number of very carefully clipped trees placed strategically within a maze or labyrinth design. Again, we can see, arboricultural skills required to get those trees looking that way. William Lawson was a very important writer of this period. His classic work, A New Orchard and Garden, actually includes the plan for an ideal garden. And this has a number of elements that are relevant to trees. And it's actually not an elite garden, it's more a garden of the gentry. What is particularly interesting about Lawson is also that he was one of the earliest writers to use the term arborist for a tree expert. This is a book well worth exploring. He has a lot of good advice to give, particularly on tree pruning as well. And it was first published in 1618. So we have within the Tudor and early Stuart gardens a number of elements that involve, quite intricate tree work, such as knots and topiary, mazes and labyrinths, mounts, banqueting trees, arbors, wildernesses. Don't be confused by the term wilderness. It's actually quite a formal arrangement of planting, where people used to go for quiet contemplation, to be on their own. I'll talk more about wildernesses, and of course avenues as well. So various elements of those gardens involving trees. We come to the first published and printed work in the English language of purely gardening interest. This is a publication called The Craft of Grafting and Planting Trees, that actually dates from around 1520. Again, this is a very early work, and the first work of gardening interest that was actually published and printed in English. And it's about trees, again, just showing the enormous significance, as you might expect, of trees in the subjects of gardening and horticulture and landscape generally. I follow up with this particular book, which was published a little bit later, but is really a major pioneering work on practical arboriculture. The book of the art and manner of how to plant and graft all sorts of trees. This was by Leonard Maskell. a British guy, first published in 1569. And this is a remarkable work. Unfortunately, some historians have dismissed this as a work of plagiarism, which is really very unfortunate. Yes, he's got many of his sources from French and Dutch literature of the time, but he's also written a lot of it in his own words, and it's his own original work. It really is an important contribution, an early contribution to practical arboriculture. It is actually available on the internet, one of the editions, and that is my own copy, the frontispiece of my own copy, one of my treasured possessions in my library. Also, forestry was starting to make good strides here. And of course, you know, there are crossovers between forestry and arboriculture in terms of the skills that are being used. This is an early work on woodland management that also calls for extensive forestry planting. Now, many people, many arboricultural students will, if you ask them, you know, who stands out from history in terms of forestry and works on forestry, we all know John Evelyn Silver. But it might come as a shock to not only students, but more established academics that this book was actually written 50 years before, and is a cracking work on woodland planting that also calls for extensive forestry planting, woodland management. 1612, an old thrift newly revived. And one of the, again, this is from my own copy. Sadly, it's not on the internet. So, you know, you can't study it unless you've got one of the very few original copies. But one of the sections in it which really struck me was he talks about the need to weed around the base of newly planting trees as being crucial. And I think to myself, 400 years on, and we're often still not doing it. Looking at various arboricultural tools from this period, this is from Leonard Maskell's book, a wonderful illustration of a whole range of tools, many of them used for pruning and grafting. We move into what we landscape historians refer to as the age of the formal garden, and we look at the role of arboriculture in that. Much of this period was heavily influenced by civil strife with turmoil, religious and political wars, and dominated by the English Civil War. It's interesting, we call it the English Civil War, but of course, you know, we should also remember that it heavily impacted on Wales and Scotland and Ireland as well. It really had a huge impact on these islands. And in the aftermath of that, the monarchy was overthrown and Britain became a republic for about 10 years until the monarchy was restored again. Now, this period is often written off by many historians, and it's most unfortunate as being a period where nothing really happened or was written about in terms of trees, forestry, arboriculture, etc. Not true. It's interesting, this particular book was published while the Civil War was still going on in 1649 by Walter Blythe. He published a revised edition of this a few years later, imaginatively entitled The English Improver Improved. It contains much on forestry and also calls for extensive planting for both profit and amenity. But unfortunately for Walter Blythe, he was soon airbrushed out of history when the monarchy was restored. He was actually a captain in the new model army, so he was definitely, and his work was definitely out of favor in the restoration. And interestingly, this book was dedicated to Oliver Cromwell. And if you look at the very top of the frontispiece, you'll see the words, Vive la République. So come the restoration of the monarchy, Walter Blythe was kind of airbrushed out of history. Another chap that's whose reputation has been greatly diminished as a result of his allegiance to the parliamentary cause was Ralph Austin. Ralph Austin wrote a wonderful book entitled The Treatise of Fruit Trees in 1653. And despite the title, it isn't actually just about fruit trees. It's about trees for both profit and pleasure, as you will see from the top of his frontispiece. That's clearly made out. Unfortunately, again, because of his allegiance to the parliamentary cause, one of his relatives was the parliamentary leader, Henry Ireton. He has tended to be dismissed. And also because he writes in a way that's quite spiritual in many respects. It's quite clear that he's a man of God, and this comes through in his writing. But he really has an awful lot to say on practical arboriculture. Unfortunately, one of the most eminent historians of recent times, Miles Hadfield, just dismissed his book by saying, "It is much concerned with moral matters and of little practical use." Well, all I can say is Miles hadn't read the book, because it is a major contribution to practical arboriculture and is slowly now being recognized as such. So we can see, come the restoration of the monarchy, we get an upturn in economic fortunes and an uptake of great gardening schemes with the restoration of the monarchy with Charles II. And he was very much preoccupied with putting his mark on the landscape as the monarch. For example, in 1661, he engaged André Mollet, the great French designer, to lay out St. James's Park. It was obviously influenced by the great French Baroque designs that were happening at this time, and he wanted a similar impact, but perhaps without the huge, enormous expense. And he certainly achieved that in many areas. I think the most outstanding landscape of this time in the formal Baroque style was at Castleberry Park, which no longer exists, sadly. The seat of the Earl of Essex, just outside what is now Watford. But this was created by his head gardener, Moses Cook. And it is the most extraordinary landscape, wonderful and pioneering forest garden. This is from a Niff and Kip hand-colored illustration from their book Illustrata Britannia Illustrata from 1708. This is a lovely print of this remarkable garden. But more about Moses Cook in a moment. Just looking at the elements of the tree-related elements of the Baroque and formal garden style, we have, of course, avenues. This was a great feature. Tree-lined walks, groves, often with palisades, wildernesses, which I've talked about, often with palisades, tunnel arbors. These are all elements of the garden that involve trees and quite a lot of tree work and delicate tree work, intricate tree work, in order to create and maintain them. This is an example of one of the most extravagant avenue layouts of the time. This is Badminton in Gloucestershire. And again, these avenues not only stretched out from the estate itself, but reached out into the surrounding countryside, linking the estate with the landscape beyond. While it's thought that not all of these avenues are actually planted, a large number of them were, and you can see what an extraordinary impact that would have had on the landscape. And we're looking here at the detail of the wilderness at Badminton in about 1707. And this is what I mean by a wilderness. It's hardly a wild area. It's a secluded area. But the amount of detailed arboricultural work that would have had to have gone into establish and maintaining such a complex feature is immediately obvious. Then we have the Palisades. If you go to Versailles or somewhere like that, you immediately notice these walls of greenery that extend. And these were featured in British Baroque landscapes. This one here at the Garden of Chiswick House. And the amount of arboricultural work required. I want to mention two major figures from the 17th century who I think are the standout tree experts from this period. The first, a very well-known figure, John Evelyn. The second, less well-known, Moses Cook. Now, I have enormous admiration for John Evelyn, but I think his work is often misunderstood. A lot of people don't realize that his work, silver, is actually a collaborative work from start to finish, really. It arose when the commissioners of the Navy invited the Royal Society to nominate 4 of their fellows to submit papers on the need for good tree management and reforestation in the wake of the destruction of the Civil War. And of those 4 individuals, one of them was John Evelyn. And when the 4 individuals had submitted their papers, the president of the Royal Society asked John Evelyn if he would collate those 4 papers and present the findings as a lecture to the Royal Society. And this went down very well. He was then asked if he would turn that into a book, which he then did on the basis of the 4 individual submissions. And he then put in a lot of other material, much of it taken from a whole range of different sources, including many from the Roman classics. Now, I'm very thankful to the eminent historian, Guy de la Bedouire, who has done a forensic examination of the text of silver, gone through it line by line, and identified where all this material, often unattributed, has actually come from. So while I would say that John Evelyn is a standout figure as a tree expert, his real genius lies in being more of a compiler of other people's thoughts and his ability to present them to the monarchy and the aristocracy and to further our knowledge of trees that way. To me, the standout real tree expert of this era is Moses Cook, who you may never have heard of, but he wrote a book in 1676, The Manner of Raising, Ordering and Improving Forest Trees. Now, while a lot of Evelyn silver was actually forestry, a lot more of this is actually arboriculture in many respects. And he also includes a huge amount on design, again, something which John Evelyn doesn't really focus on. And when he does in his later editions, he refers to the work of Moses Cook. But the problem with this book and the way it's regarded today is that the first edition is not available. It's a very rare thing to actually have a first edition. And I'm blessed with having this. This is one of the jewels of my library. The second edition, which is 1717, is available on the internet. But it kind of gives the impression that's fostered by many current historians is that Moses Cook actually came sometime after John Evelyn. Well, unfortunately, that's not the case. And I actually, in investigating this, I found a very telling little passage from Moses Cook's book. And he talks about John Evelyn in the context of raising ash trees from seed. And he says, "I will give you the same advice that I gave that honorable gentleman before he wrote the Discourse of Forest Trees." And I read that, I was knocked over, because it tells you quite clearly that Moses Cook was giving advice to trees on an arboriculture to John Evelyn before he wrote the Discourse of Forest Trees. And, you know, all I can say, I could talk for hours about this guy. He is, to me, the standout tree expert of this period. I mean, don't get me wrong, John Evelyn is a major figure, but Moses Cook is, for my mind, the man. What's also important about Moses Cook is that apart from being, you know, a professional tree man, he actually started along with 3 other guys, the famous Brompton Park nursery and landscape business. This actually dominated the whole of the early 18th century in terms of nursery propagation and landscape construction. And this is an example of their work, again from Niff and Kipps, Britannia Illustrata, shows the vast quantity of trees and shrubs that was provided by the Brompton Park Nursery. So this was created by George London. London and Wise came later. When Moses Cook retired, he sold his share to Wise, and it became London and Wise as the main protagonists of this particular venture. But it really was the standout nursery and landscape business of the period. Interestingly, their nursery was actually located where the museums are in South Kensington today. So we come to English arboriculture in the English landscape garden. I better get a bit of a spurt on because I'm conscious of the time here. I could have shown a lot of different examples of the English landscape garden, but I've particularly chosen Stowe, one of my own favourite gardens in Buckinghamshire. And the reason I've done that is because many famous landscape gardeners actually worked on this, including Charles Bridgman, William Kent, Lancelot Capability Brown. And the English landscape garden and the demand for plants and the creation of these landscapes really saw the beginnings of what we might call a nursery industry, and then a landscape industry, which were very important. Tree-related features of the English landscape garden. I'll just skeet over these: belts, clumps, groves, etc. The pleasure ground was really the main part where there was a lot of arboricultural work required, more the ornamental areas. Here in the pleasure ground at Branston House, this is a print from 1779, we see what is obviously what we Arbs would call crown lifting undertaken. And this was to give a greater visibility to the shrub layer and allow more light to this. So, we've got quite a lot of arboricultural work taking place actually in the pleasure ground. At this time, there was a dramatic increase, steady increase in the number of urban trees, and not just in private residential gardens. This is a view of the Mall in St. James's Park. This is probably a forerunner of what we might think of later as street trees, and also in terms of like a public park. And also the development of the pleasure gardens. These were forerunners of public parks in the sense that they were areas that people could go and stroll around in, and they were charged admission to get in, but there were lots of entertainments and refreshments on offer as well. But what was interesting about these pleasure gardens was that they were often quite covered with quite dense tree cover, and integrating lots of people and some quite lively entertainments in amongst a lot of trees presented some real management challenges. And in my book, I go into some of the arboricultural practices that were involved in this, and early examples of tree risk management. I want to mention Humphrey Repton. He was the consummate professional when it came to landscape gardening, a a term that he coined himself. And what was interesting about Humphrey Repton is that a lot of the earlier landscape people were not only consultants, they were also contractors, but Humphrey Repton was very much a consultant. Other people were involved in actually delivering the work. I'm going to skip that one and move on to just to finish off this period by saying that the landscape garden focused mainly on basic forestry skills, such as mass planting and tree removal and stump removal. That was the nature of the English landscape garden. It was much more related to forestry skills rather than horticulture and arboricultural skills, which tended to really only focus in the on the pleasure ground near the house. So now we come to the 19th century, and I've termed this heroic arboriculture in the 19th century, which I hopefully will become clear to you. Just begin by mentioning John Claudius Loudon. I could give an entire lecture on this gentleman. He's the most distinguished tree expert of the 19th century, a remarkable source of material for me in terms of researching this subject. Wrote many, many books and was a really remarkable figure. The great tree expert of the 19th century. Also, material gained from early publications on gardening. Gardener's Magazine, that was actually the first sort of dedicated gardening magazine that was actually started by John Claudius Loudon. The Gardener's Chronicle from 1841, that actually runs to the present day because our Horticulture Week, which many of us still read, is actually the latest variation of the title of this very long-running publication. And we also start to see specifically arboricultural publications. This is Transactions of the Scottish Arboricultural Society. The 18th century saw a revival of the formal garden, and this demanded a lot more arboricultural work than the English landscape garden, in the sense that, you know, there's quite a lot of intricate topiary, grafts involved. This is an early example, Elverston Garden in Derbyshire, where William Barron was employed to create this actually quite remarkable feature. But the 19th century definitely saw a revival of the formal garden and the skills associated with that. The Victorian Parks movement, again, you're probably familiar with, you know, how public parks started to be developed. But that, you know, a lot of those were on the in urban areas, or on the periphery of urban areas. So we saw a huge increase in urban trees as a result of that, and many tree-related features and formal elements that required often a lot of pruning and other arboricultural work. The Victorian street tree movement, well, as I say, this is a focus of a huge amount in my book, Street Trees in Britain, a History, where I go into this in considerable detail. But in a nutshell, it was major challenges for tree selection, planting, maintenance, and management. But what all this did, the urban parks and the Victorian street tree movement, it gave a huge boost to the scale and scope of professional arboriculture in Britain. Huge, you know, people were needed to plant and maintain these trees in urban situations. And people soon realized that, you know, there were quite specific skills involved in managing large trees in a built environment that was quite different from horticulture and forestry. And this was really, you know, at the end of this period, we saw arboriculture being recognized as a quite separate discipline from horticulture and forestry, the standalone tree professional. Tree moving, this is a major feature of the 19th century, a lot of interest on tree moving. This is Sir William Stuart moving trees on his Allerton estate in Scotland. As you can see, these trees, this was about 1828. This tree is bare rooted. The gentlemen in top hats in the tree are what we call balance men, and they're there to stop the tree actually upending as it's being moved, to hold it down horizontally. They're called balance men. Sir Henry Stuart got a lot of publicity for his tree moving experts, but the real expert on tree moving in the 19th century, certainly the second half of it, was William Barron himself, the man I mentioned earlier about creating the garden at Elveston. He's also a renowned tree expert, but he designed and built a number of specialist tree moving apparatus. And here is one of his transplanting machines being used at the Royal Botanical Society's gardens in Regent Park. This got a lot of publicity and generated a lot of interest in tree moving. And it leads me neatly onto this quite remarkable photograph. I was absolutely delighted to get my hands on this photograph. This is William Barron himself. The photograph is 1880. And here he is moving a tree known as the Buckland Yew. This is a tree that is mentioned in the Domesday Book. And some years earlier, it had been damaged when a vault was put into the side of the church where it was growing next to. And the tree was starting to decline. And it was decided the only way of saving this tree was to actually move it, this amazingly 1,000-year-old historic tree. So that's precisely what William Barron and his workforce decided to do. And you'll see him here in the actual operation of moving it. That's him in the top hat and the umbrella, members of his family standing next to him, and his workforce. Now, I'm blown away by this photograph every time I see it. And if you look in the book, it's even sharper. It's produced here, low resolution for my PowerPoint, but it's a truly remarkable photograph. However, William Barron actually got quite a lot of criticism for this, moving this tree. The editors of the Gardener's Chronicle said that to move such a tree was sacrilege. So he wrote a letter to the editors explaining why the tree had to be moved and, necessity to give it another lease of life. It was only moved about 50 yards in total, but it was an important factor in reviving the tree. And so he wrote all this down in a letter to the editors of the Gardener's Chronicle. And they published his letter, but at the bottom they added a note saying, we still think that it's a bad idea to move this tree. And they sarcastically added, no doubt Mr. Barron could move Westminster Abbey given the right equipment, but we still feel it would be a sacrilege to do so. He got a lot of criticism for this, but as it turned out, the tree thrived and his reputation was not too severely damaged. From the mid-19th century, many contemporary images and texts indicate the rise and the increase in the amount of preventative and remedial tree care. Don't forget that this sort of work would have been a no-no in the English landscape garden and the picturesque, where everything had to be entirely natural. But we see, certainly from images, the increasing use of props, starting bracing and cavity work that increasingly common, particularly on old and ancient trees. This is the Calthorpe oak in Yorkshire, then the largest oak tree in England. The print is from 1872. Tree pruning. A lot of discussion in my book about tree pruning from the 19th century. Unfortunately, the British were sort of going around in circles on this, and much of it was focused on the pruning of timber. The French, however, making very good progress. This was, I refer to Count Descartes' original work in 1864. This was classic work on tree pruning, translated from the 7th edition in 1881 by Charles Sargent, then professor of arboriculture at Harvard, and eventually published in Britain in 1893. Just some tree pruning equipment here. The French invented arboraculture, heavy-duty pruning shears, and the British invented long-reach pruner. This front page from the graphic, a popular magazine from 1878, shows a steam-powered tree feller being demonstrated at Tulse Hill in London in the presence of William Gladstone, the famous politician. Interesting, development of new machinery. And also this was an era that put a huge focus on trees and urban development. And one of the interesting projects that helped to do this was the retention of the elms within the Crystal Palace for the Great Exhibition. As you may know, the Great Exhibition, the Crystal Palace, 1851, I think. There were trees on the site, but it was decided that these trees would be retained, and the design of the Crystal Palace altered to accommodate these trees. And many of the popular magazines of the time, followed this story in great detail, particularly the Illustrated London News. And some 800,000 people, visited the Crystal Palace and marveled at this this amazing inclusion of these trees. And this is why I tend to refer to this as the age of heroic arboriculture, because you've got these incredible tree moving exploits and the remarkable feats of incorporating the elm in Crystal Palace. It was almost on a par with the engineering feats of people like Brunel. This was what I call heroic arboriculture, just like heroic engineering. We get the foundation of the early arboricultural societies, called arboricultural societies, but they were actually, primarily concerned with forestry. It was only towards the end of the 18th century, 19th century, that we recognize arboriculture as distinct from forestry. And later on, these societies actually changed their name to become forestry societies, which conveniently brings us to the 20th century, or the first part of the 20th century. I better get a little bit of a move on here. I call this the rise of the tree experts. Don't forget, there's a huge increase in suburban properties with small gardens that, people planting trees in their gardens. And this also gave, a lot of boost to the private sector side of arboriculture. But I would contrast that with what was happening in America at that time. This is an advertisement, Davy, from the Davy Institute of Tree Surgery. This dates from 1913, I think, and it's entitled "Learn the New Profession, Tree Surgery." This is an opportunity for people to earn a lot of money, plenty of good salaries available, job positions, and also formal courses. Well, in Britain itself, all that had to wait for quite a while. So in those days, in terms of developing an industry and a profession, America was way ahead. One of the great tree experts of this time, William Dallimore, he was a man who trained at Kew and rose to the position of assistant curator, is the most notable tree expert from Kew at this time. And I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the name William Dallimore. His book here, I've illustrated the cover of it, Pruning of Trees and Shrubs. This is important in being one of the earliest works that actually talks about tree work up in the tree, using ropes to remove large branches and such like. But the standout tree expert of this era has to be Denis Lesueur and his book, The Care and Repair of Ornamental Trees. I could speak a lot about Denis Lesueur, but he is, to my mind, the standout tree expert of the first half of the 20th century. I've got a range of advertisements here of early machinery from those from the 20s and 30s that appear in the book. This is an absolutely fascinating photograph. We often think that the Americans were the pioneers in terms of using ropes and harnesses in tree care, but this is actually a photograph from 1895, a French tree pruner. And it's certainly true that the French were ahead of the game of anyone at this period in time in development of working in trees with ropes and harnesses. And indeed, the first use of rope and harness in Britain was by arborists at the City of London Corporation in the late 20s. And they used a belt known as the City of Paris safety belt, came from Paris and was imported from France by Denis Lesueur. However, although Denis Lesueur, urged other people to use a rope and safety harness, it really didn't catch on until after the Second World War. Just to mention that other craftsmen were involved in tree surgery work. This is a group of blacksmiths working at the Major Oak around the 1900s, putting lead sheets over decayed areas. So it wasn't just tree experts, carpenters and blacksmiths were also involved in tree work. The emerging specialism of urban arboriculture, many of those trees from the middle and late Victorian era were now starting to mature in urban areas. And this again promoting great challenges for local authorities. And until recently, it was thought that we didn't have any specialist tree officers until the 1950s and 60s. Well, my research has actually shown that a number of local authorities actually had specialist tree officer posts in the 20s and 30s. A range of tree surgery companies around this time. And we come to the last part now, and I'll sort of move through this fairly quickly. Professional arboriculture comes of age from the end of the Second World War to the present. I've got a whole range of advertisements of equipment that are in the book. Some of these are very interesting, and some of them I'm sure you've used yourself. The Arbrex, don't we all remember that? And the Still 020, I use that a lot. The introduction of heavy equipment. This is the brushwood chipper. Much of this gear actually imported from the United States. Brushwood chippers, stump grinders, mobile platforms and that sort of thing. But a huge introduction of machinery. This is one of the earliest examples of the woodchuck, a British manufacture, although the mechanism itself was purchased from America. The use of ropes and harnesses suddenly became a lot more popular, and this was actually a standout event. This was at a conference at Merriswood College in 1967, a demonstration of a Barrow and Hepburn harness. You might recognize Peter Bridgman there in the center, the great Peter Bridgman giving the instructions about this. And also you might recognize the two Honey brothers in that photograph as well, whose equipment it was. And after this particular demonstration, the company Barrow and Hepburn sold out their entire stock of harnesses and had to order a whole lot more. So this was really quite a standout event in terms of getting that equipment known and used in the tree industry. A lot of advertisements for some of the early companies involved in tree work in Britain. Local authority tree officers. Well, I mentioned that there were some before the war, but from 1953, we had the appointment of Ted Story as arboricultural officer for the London County Council. And I'm pleased to say I was privileged to know Ted, a really great guy, a real gentleman and tree expert. By 1999, 69% of local authorities in Britain had at least one specialist tree officer who had a tree-specific job title. And some of the larger urban authorities had several tree officers. I remember myself when I was at Wandsworth, I was the senior officer of 7 tree officers and something like 30-something manual staff. We had a really large section, and that was back in 1980. What's also interesting about these tree officers in 1999 is 62% of them described themselves as coming from an arboricultural background. We got the development of various organizations specializing in arboriculture. Again, you know, a lot in the book about this. I'm not going to bore you with that tonight. Just to go back to that previous slide, this is a wonderful advertisement that was issued by the Association of British Tree Surgeons and Arborists that later merged with the Arboriculture Association. I think that's a stunning image. I'm not sure whether that would be allowed today, but it certainly got the message about the need to consult a qualified tree surgeon. The Arboricultural Association journal that started up, that's the first issue in '65. And then the Arboricultural Advisory and Information Service that was started in '76, led by the great Derek Patch, did a huge amount of work in promoting research and practice in arboriculture. We got courses in arboriculture. This little pamphlet on the left-hand side is a wonderful little document. The first course for tree surgeons held at Merris Wood College in 1967. And then, you know, we've developed enormously to the point where we now have a master's degree in arboriculture and urban forestry. At Myerscough College in 2008, we offered the first master's degree in arboriculture and urban forestry. And many of those courses now at Myerscough College are online, so people from around the world can study arboriculture and get a degree level qualification. Just a little word on women in arboriculture. This is one of the themes of the book, actually, and there's an awful lot of information on this, but you won't be perhaps surprised to learn that, you know, women really didn't feature, certainly not in arboriculture, but also in horticulture until more recent times. These are the first women gardeners at Kew in 1896. And also women in arboriculture is a fairly recent development. And I'm proud to say that developing degree courses at Myerscough College has really opened up arboriculture for women. And you don't have to climb like a monkey to have an excellent career in arboriculture, although there are some women who are also excellent climbers. But the BSc honours in arboriculture from 1998, we got a heck of a lot of women coming through and qualifying with degrees in arboriculture and making a huge contribution to the industry. Just a little word on practical arboriculture. Peter Bridgman's pioneering book. I certainly regard Peter Bridgman as, you know, there's nobody, in terms of the second half of the 20th century, I don't think anybody has made a greater contribution to British arboriculture than Peter Bridgman. And my hat goes off to him. His book, Tree Surgery, pioneering book. Also the Shigo Revolution, that turned everything on its head, as we well know. But as I point out in the book, not everything Shigo said was new. And there are examples that I've quoted of knowledge that parallels this, was said much earlier but got lost. Just to mention what I call the urban forestry revolution, the Seed in Time conferences, perhaps arboriculturists, certainly the leadership of arboriculture, a bit slow to get on board. But now I'm pleased to say that organizations like the Arboricultural Association are taking a lead in this. And I'm absolutely delighted to see that. Briefly mention the Trees in Towns study. The first one done in '93 was a pioneering study of urban trees. Trees in Towns 2 came in, published in 2008. Why this was such a milestone, Trees in Towns 2, is worth pointing out. Not only was it a huge research project, which I was very privileged to lead and be the main author. The report itself extends to 650 pages, but it was led mainly by arboriculturists. And that was the first time that a major government report of that type in Britain had been led by arboriculturists. I wrote a list of the people that made a significant contribution to it the other night, and some 25 individuals, many of whose names would be familiar to you, took part in this. And so it was groundbreaking, and also groundbreaking in that it set targets that we wanted local authorities to achieve. So just to round off now, finish off, public sector arboriculture has been under severe pressure since the early 1980s. And as someone who actually got out of it as a result of having my entire tree section privatized, I'm very conscious of this. Privatization, rate capping, the austerity agenda of the last 10 years has really crippled private sector arboriculture in many ways. And now we are experiencing a real skills shortage, a lack of people going into arboriculture and choosing arboriculture as a career. This needs to be urgently addressed and action taken. But I will end on an optimistic note. All right, we live in some very challenging environmental times, but tree experts, particularly in an urban environment, are needed now more than ever. We need tree experts to really make a difference in our towns and cities, and to champion arboriculture, and to show, what it can do to actually make our towns and cities livable and healthy places. So yes, let's start selling the importance of the tree experts. So there's the book. It's available from a lot of different outlets, but what I would urge you, please buy it from the Arboricultural Association's online bookshop, because that way you'll be helping the Arboricultural Association, and it's also being offered at a very generous discount. So please, get the book, but get it from the online bookshop at the Arboricultural Association. Many thanks for your attention, much appreciated. There's my email address. Please contact me. Let me know any way that I can answer your questions if I don't answer them now. Thanks, John.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was absolutely brilliant. Really, really great. I don't think we've done a lot of these webinars now, and I always keep a little eye on the audience numbers, and I think the number of people in the audience dropped by a smaller margin across the course of this than in any other webinar we've ever done. That's not to say they're not all brilliant, but basically everyone who started finished.
I'm amazed. There's nearly 300 people out there.
Yeah, we've had 300 watching, so absolutely awesome. Although you did shock me with a picture of Margaret Thatcher at the end there that I wasn't expecting, and that's the first time we've had one of those in our webinar.
Did that deliberately.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. Okay, we've got lots of questions in. Now, we'll probably do about 15, 20 minutes of questions, folks.
Yeah.
We won't get through all of them, but what we will do is we'll make sure we send Mark all of the chat and all the questions, and then if there's any particular ones he wants to pick up on, he'll be able to do that. So loads and loads of questions. One of the questions, Jeff asked a question that I really liked when you were showing some of those fantastic images of the illustrations of those gardens, the amazingly designed landscape gardens. Jeff's asked, how much of those illustrations are of the proposed layouts as opposed to what was actually built? Were these old-fashioned versions of these amazing designer artists' impressions of what the new development's going to look like, or was that a representation of what happened?
Yeah, if you're talking about those ones that were taken from Niff and Kip's
Yes.
Britannia Illustrata, that in most cases the majority of those are actually as they were. The one that I focused on, Badminton, with all its avenues, well, not quite all those avenues were apparently planted. I also showed the one of Castleberry Park. We know from detailed research that is exactly how it was. There's one part of the house that is represented that wasn't actually built, but in terms of the garden itself, yes, it was. So in most cases, those were actually realized on the ground in the majority of cases, yeah.
Fantastic. Someone asked, and I've lost it now, but it kind of leads on from there. Oh, here we go. Yeah, Chris asked, many of the intricate gardens with regular patterns and mazes, labyrinths were absolutely massive. Did those designs reflect things like people traveling by horseback? Were these intended to be enjoyed on horses, or was it purely for walking? They seem to be a much bigger scale than we would deal with now.
Well, certainly, you know, when you come to that amazing array of avenues at Badminton, you know, you wouldn't get too far just walking on foot, perhaps. In, you know, well, maybe you could, but you know, they would also be, you know, entrances, grand entrances to the actual property where people would often arrive in carriage or by horseback. More of the walking was perhaps in the more immediate vicinity of the main house, but a mixture, I think. I mean, how many of you have, you know, been to Versailles and seen the incredible landscape there? You know, and I mean, Anne and I spent, you know, 2 days at Versailles and just would have loved to have spent longer just walking the whole area. I don't know how many ordinary people in that time would have done that, but, you know, it was a lovely walking experience.
You should have done it on horseback.
Yeah, I should have done it on horseback.
Thank you. Okay, now there's a couple of questions we've got here. So Ian's asked a good question about the fact that post-planting aftercare is an often neglected aspect of tree care. And we hear now all the time this obsession with tree planting, but no one's looking to how those trees are actually going to survive. Ian's asking, in your research, did you find any instances of where aftercare for trees was given sort of greater attention in any historical period than it is now?
I don't know in terms of, you know, overall in any particular era, but I did highlight that example from 1612, your man Joseph Rock Church, who actually highlighted the importance of weeding around the base of the tree, and that was like 400 years ago. I mean, you will find examples throughout, you know, the centuries of this, but any particular period, I don't think it's really possible to say. I mean, it's certainly mentioned. That's, you know, if you go back to Roman literature, you know, you'll find references to post-planting maintenance. Mm-hmm. But it does kind of amaze me, you know, when I look at a lot of the landscape projects that I see happening today, the sheer lack of post-planting maintenance. And we've known this for since the Romans, and we're still not doing it properly. You know, the idea that you plant a tree and you walk away and you forget it, you know, what's that about?
Yeah, that's certainly a battle we're still fighting all the time now. Okay, well, the question that I was going to ask, if no one else did, but Ben has asked it, so thank you, Ben. Ben says, great presentation. My question is, what do you think we as modern arbs can learn and apply to today's management from this long and extensive history? I suppose I'd add to that, you know, of all the things that you've researched and read about, were there any bits that you thought, why did we stop doing that? Well, that's something we should be doing again.
That's a very good question. I think, you know, the application of sound arboricultural knowledge, you know, something that comes out through, you know, the generations past, you know, finding out from, you know, practical experience and from research what works and what doesn't. We often accept things without question. One of the reasons I like that book by William Lawson and also the one by Ralph Austin is they have sections in the book called errors, and they question things. And one of the things that Moses Cook kept repeating was, you know, I don't take things on face value. I find out if it works for myself, you know, and I learn from experience. So, you know, be questioning, always don't just accept things. One of the points that I make in my book, and it was actually a question from a lecture on this I gave a few weeks back. Somebody said, the trouble with those tree experts, the modern tree experts, they got it all wrong, didn't they? Because that man Shigo came along and he told them all the things that they were doing wrong. And I actually pointed out, and it's in the book, and you may be aware of this, that Denis Lasser, if you read his book, 1934, he talks about the importance of pruning to the furthest extent of the branch ring, is exactly saying what Shigo is saying about the branch collar. And it was there in 1934, but who listened to him? And also about cavity treatment as well. W.E. Hilly was actually questioning the whole basis of cavity treatment in 1917 and saying, this is not even based on knowledge that we know then. So, keep questioning, don't take things for granted, judge them by your own experience and your own, practical knowledge.
There you go. Some sound advice. That is for life as well as arboriculture, I'd say, for everybody. Right, Christina's asked a good question, just to put you on the spot. Christina said, women in arboriculture were mentioned, but what about women authors of arboricultural publications? Are there any women authors? Christina specifically asked anything published before the 20th century, but have you got any ideas about, a lot of these books have been written by men, basically, haven't they?
Well, that's absolutely true, yes. Yes. Well, I would point out some useful contributions for women that made to Trees in Towns too. There was a whole section there. Right, it was actually written by me, but it was based on the work of the late great Ruth Chapman. I don't know if anybody remembers Ruth. She was a very good friend of mine. I was at Westminster and then Dacorum Borough Council, and did a huge lot of pioneering work, and all her experience on an integrated local authority team stretching across all the different departmental responsibilities that went into that particular case study. A number of women, made a great contribution. I can't think of, in terms of anybody who's actually written a full-length book. I can give that some thought, but off the top of my head, I can't actually think of anybody who's written a textbook as such, but I could be wrong.
Well, if anyone knows of anything, I'm sure they'll be quick to correct us in the chat.
I just would mention, I did mention the original Trees in Town study. Well, don't forget that, that was commissioned by the great Caroline Davis. And, that was a huge contribution of which we built on with Trees in Towns too. So yes, yeah. Caroline Davis, was a prime mover behind the original Trees in Town study.
Absolutely. A couple of people are putting names in the chat. I've seen Lynn Body appear on the chat. We're talking, I think Christina was specifically asking about pre-20th century. So unless you're casting aspersions on Lynn's age, Lynn wasn't writing books then.
Sorry. Absolutely.
Okay, you mentioned Trees in Towns too. This isn't a question that's been asked, but I'm misusing my position to ask it. I often wonder, Matt, when I see this talk at the moment about, every local authority should write a tree strategy. Wouldn't it be great if every local authority had a tree strategy, as if it's a sort of new idea? And I think Trees in Towns 2 was 2008, wasn't it? And one of your main recommendations in that, I believe, was that every town should have a tree strategy. And I wonder if you ever sort of have a wry smile at the fact that it's taken about 15 years for people to start listening.
I really, I'm a bit sad about it in some ways. And one of the things, and I don't want to dwell on this tonight, but, Trees in Towns 2 had 10 targets. And, I worked with Peter Annett. I don't know if you remember Peter Annett, who was former chairman of the Arb Association, and he was the man who commissioned Trees in Towns 2. And I worked closely with Peter in delivering it. And it was a huge breakthrough that we actually got government permission to put in 10 targets in Trees in Towns 2. And we expected the professional organizations to really seize on that and promote it. And one of them was, develop a tree strategy. Another one was having a proper tree officer. Another one was, having a computerized tree management system. These were there at the time, but unfortunately the industry missed a real trick in not actually promoting those to local authorities. So yeah, we're maybe playing catch up now, but tree strategies are as relevant now as they ever were. And when we talk about, the 4 stages. What do we have? What do we want? What do we do? And what are we getting? That's actually, the basis of the planning process. That's not something, that's unique to arboriculture. If you're going to have a planned strategy of any sort, those are the 4 stages that you go through.
Absolutely.
So, we'll still keep pushing it because it's as relevant now as it ever was.
Yeah, no, quite right. Well, Chris very kindly said everyone could borrow the Stonehouse tree strategy, which I put in the chat because I'm always quick to promote the Stonehouse tree strategy. So you guys knock yourselves out, but other very good strategies are available too.
By the way, on that Trees in Towns 2 thing, I did mention, the final document is a report of 650 pages, and it was only ever produced on a disc. I don't know if you know that. But if you want a hard copy, I can tell you where to get a cheap hard copy. Yes, go to lulu.com. This is a self-publishing website, and you will find it there on offer at it's only black and white, it's not color, but you can get a hard copy of Trees in Towns 2, the full 650-page report from lulu.com.
Good tip, Mark. Thank you. I'm sure you've all been listening out there. So
hopefully you'll get one in your library there at the AA.
Yes, well, I'm sure we've got one here. We must have
an actual hard copy. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
If we haven't got one here in the National Library of Arboriculture, and that's not just my shelves behind me, everybody, by the way, we've got a whole room through there full of books.
You'll also find from the same website the 2 conference proceedings from Trees, People and the Built Environment 1 and 2 are also available, and they're full color. Those are. You can get them from the same website.
There's already people.
I just find it so much easier to have a hard copy in my hands. I'm somewhat old-fashioned in that respect, rather than trying to read something off a disc.
I'm very much with you there, Mark. Right, a couple more questions. Ian's asked another question about, does the historical record make much mention of the safety of the practitioners? You showed the one image there, I think you said from France, where there was ropes involved, but I don't know whether that was safety orientated or just more convenient.
That's a very good point, because certainly I've done a huge amount of research over the centuries in documents, and there's very little actually relates to safety, very little. And it's only in the late 19th century that you start to get any significant mention of the safety aspects of working with trees. There's quite a lot on the techniques involved and such like, but very little to actually, the safety of tree workers or the safety of people around tree work. So yeah, the answer to that is I certainly haven't found much evidence of that.
Interesting. I suppose chainsaws would have made it more dangerous again and given more.
Well, that's true. Yeah, and plus the increasing number of urban trees, large trees in an urban environment. Don't forget, all those trees that were planted in the late Victorian era were only starting to mature then in the sort of Edwardian and early 20s and 30s. So that's probably partly the reason.
This is another question that wasn't submitted, but this is just one that I'm going to ask again. You showed one image of London that I think was Victoria Embankment with all the newly planted trees around it, the drawing. Now, I was told, I found an old postcard of Victoria Embankment, which I was very proud to have used to have managed the trees along there when I worked for Transport for London. And I was told, and it looks like from the images, that the Victorians planted basically twice as many trees along there as they needed. And then as they grew to maturity, they essentially removed every other one, which is the avenue we're left with today. Is that something is that anecdotal or is that true?
No, there's a certain amount in that, yes. Trees, and you'll pick this up from my book on street trees. You look at the planting distances between street trees in the late Victorian era, they're really ridiculously too close. But I think to a certain extent, this was deliberate. That trees would die and need to be pulled out, and you'd end up with something relatively reasonable. I don't think it was, they were all planted up because people had no idea of what they would grow in terms of, maturity. But the planting distances are ridiculously close, but I can only assume, I haven't found any actual, I'm trying to think now, maybe there is some reference to that, to actually, taking out every other tree later. I would have to check in my book on street trees, but I think there might be some evidence of that, yeah.
And very forward thinking, isn't it? It'd be very difficult to make that case today, to say, well, we're planting twice as many trees as we need, and then we're going to cut half of them down in 15 years' time. That wouldn't go down very well.
It wouldn't happen today, would it, John? No.
And Reg has made a comment really about the Reg Harris, talking about the ancient yew that you showed being moved, which I think was, of all the amazing images in your presentation, that one of the huge yew being transported was one of the most amazing. But Reg is saying, can you imagine moving something so old today? It just wouldn't, it wouldn't be allowed, I wouldn't have thought today.
It's interesting, isn't it? Yes, I mean, it caused a real controversy back in 1880. What an amazing image that is. You say, I could just stare into that. The faces of the workforce, that's just remarkable, But I've got that, high resolution, and it's now been restored expertly. That's a wonderful image, that.
I think we might have to get a copy of that to adorn the walls of the malt house here for the Arbor Association.
Not a problem.
Okay, now where are we? Chris Knappman. Hello, Chris. Chris has asked, Mark, what are your thoughts on the emergence of conservation arboriculture or tree ecologists?
Yes. No, I think a huge amount of good work has been done on this. But there's a place for everything. To my mind, I was always, battling conservationists as a tree officer in terms of street trees, because of course, you've got to be very conscious of the safety aspects of all this, but, where it is possible, promote ecology at every opportunity. But you have to also balance that with the risk to the public.
Absolutely.
But no, a lot of good work done on conservation of arboriculture.
And I guess tying in some ways with the risk element, Chris has asked another question about when in the picturesque conception with the fake rural views and everything, were they ever thinking about deadwood and standing deadwood? Do you know if they saw standing deadwood either as aesthetically beautiful or as having a function as we know it does now for habitat and everything? And Chris has asked whether or not there was a clash between the need for wood in the commons and as something that the common people would be using for firewood, etc., and then either aesthetics or sort of habitat concepts.
Well, no, I mean, the answer to that is that, dead wood and trees with large dead branches, even dead trees, were very much part of the English landscape garden and the picturesque movement. I actually talk about the great landscape gardener, William Kent, actually transplanting large dead trees, to put into the landscape quite deliberately. People laughed at him, but, they added character to it. So the dead wood would be left there. But in terms of, what people could use, of course, ordinary mortals like ourselves weren't allowed anywhere near those landscapes. They were all private, very much private landscapes of exclusion, as one historian has signified them. They're there for the monarchy, the aristocracy, and their friends. And they
plunder of the commons.
Sorry.
The plunder of the commons.
Couldn't we talk about that? Yes. And again, that is actually, we touch on that in the book. The English, how the English landscape garden was created with some very unfortunate side effects.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah, including whole villages being destroyed when they got in the way of the view in some situations.
Yeah, roads closed and all sorts.
I'll stop myself there, right, lest I get on my little soapbox. One question, right, well, I'll ask you one question from me, and then there's one more question I'll go to from Kate. But I was going to ask, it's going to put you on the spot again, but obviously you've done so much research, you've looked at so many books. I was wondering, do any of those books you've looked at and researched sort of spring out as being one that you would recommend to people to read? We often have a sort of book club segment, and we ask our presenters to give their favourite arboricultural book, and I think that you've read probably too many, but is there one that jumps out that you'd recommend?
What, in terms of its importance in the history of arboriculture? Not
in terms of importance or even just enjoyable.
Well, I think, standout publication for me would be Moses Cook's The Manner of Ordering Planting Forest Trees. Moses Cook on Forest Trees, 1676, the first edition. To me, is a phenomenal piece of work, and everyone knows Evelyn Silver, but many people don't know that. And it really is, a great piece of work. Yeah. In more recent times, I would say Denis Lasser, The Care and Repair of Ornamental Trees, 1934, is a real standout work in terms of British arboriculture in the first half of the 20th century. So I could probably sort of pick out standout works from each sort of period. But there's so many good books, interesting books.
I think we're going to we'll get you back and we'll do a sort of book review as well. We'll put a twist on your research and do a book review of all the stuff you've read. Right, last question, I think, and it's a question from Kate. Bit of a challenge to you, Mark. What do you think the next age of arboriculture might be called, or should be called?
The age of environmental arboriculture. This is my passion now, is that, we are the tree experts. There are so many environmental challenges out there that we can make a major contribution to. We need to stand up and be counted. We're not part of horticulture. We're not part of forestry. We are tree experts. We are arboriculturists, and we have a long and proud tradition as an industry and a profession. And we can make a massive contribution, particularly in urban areas, to the challenges that we now face. That I would like to think would be the next stage for arboriculture.
I think that is an absolutely perfect answer for us to end on. That's brilliant. Mark, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such a pleasure.
John, and it's been a privilege and a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our audience. As always, you're all lovely and you're all brilliant. And hopefully we'll see you again next week. If you're sitting there at home thinking, my goodness, I wish I could see some of those pictures in close up. Well, you can. It's right here. You can't read this one, obviously, because I'm not going to sit here reading it to you for the whole evening. I've got a life too. I haven't. But you can order that online through our website, and Sarah's just put the link in there. So, Mark, thank you very much. Our audience, thank you very much. Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully see you all next week, and stay safe. Look after yourselves. Bye-bye.
Goodbye from Ireland, and don't forget to enjoy Paddy's Day tomorrow.
Quite right.